I'd like to continue now, today, this piece from Shigehiko Hasumi, John Ford, The Eloquence of Gesture. The second part of 3 of this essay is translated from the original French by Adrian Martin into English. Visible but eluding perception. In his work, Ford takes recourse to the throwing theme at the most decisive moments, even if critics have never noticed it. Tellingly, one of the rare commentaries to allude to the mailbag thrown from the train in Dr. Bull comes from a filmmaker, Jean-Marie Straub. In an interview with Charles Tesson, he declared, "The important thing is that Ford has no style. What is there in common between Three Bad Men 1926 and the Will Rogers films, especially my favourite, The Magnificent Dr. Bull, which sums up the entirety of neorealism? When you look at the way the film establishes a little provincial town, the arriving train, the bag of letters on the platform, the girl who comes for the post, it's only an hour later that you understand why. The entire establishing section is completely documentary." We should note that Straub is sensitive neither to the subject nor the story of the film, but to pure actions, the arriving train, the bag of letters on the platform, the girl who comes for the post. Ford's mise-en-scene does not resort to a psychological and narrative logic, but to a succession of isolated gestures. The term documentary used to describe the establishing of this little provincial town is applied precisely to the succession of neutral, everyday gestures ritualized by virtue of this neutrality. The throwing theme is visible, but what is specific to this filmmaker is rarely perceived. Wherein the necessity of reflecting upon what we call Ford's style, it is true that the documentary label for rural life in Dr. Bull is not applicable to the river race in Steamboat Round the Bend. Following Straub, we can pose the question, what is there in common between the three Will Rogers films produced by Fox and the films made almost simultaneously by Ford for RKO, The Lost Patrol, 1934, and The Informer, 1935? The Fox films have no pretension. Ford is content merely to assemble them. By contrast, in The Lost Patrol, and especially The Informer, the author shows an aesthetic, even political, ambition. The lighting of the small provincial town in Dr. Bull contrasts with the nocturnal scene of expressionistic shadows in Dublin, reconstituted in the studio for The Informer. There is nothing dramatic in the description of populist medicine in a rural community compared to the tearing inner conflict of the Irish proletarian. If one were not familiar with Ford's filmography, it would be hard to believe that these two films were made by the same director, but our thematic perspective allows us to recognize what connects them. Jippo Nolan, Victor McLaglen in The Informer, is presented to us like other Fordian characters, throwing away a cigarette butt. Noticing in the night his girlfriend is being harassed by a shady character, he throws his cigarette over his shoulder before approaching them. Jippo pushes the man to the ground, but his gesture is misplaced, for his girlfriend loses a client. He will die because of her, after having denounced a comrade. The throwing theme here requires a tragic hue. Smoking/throwing. Of course there are 1,000 ways to film characters smoking, something that appears in virtually every movie. In Ford, however, people smoke at decisive moments. No one throws away his matches, cigarettes or cigars with as much perseverance as in his work. In How the West Was Won, during the discussion between General Sherman, John Wayne, and General Grant, Henry Morgan, on the obligations of war, we find it natural that they smoke a cigar. Wayne smokes for the sole purpose of power, throwing his cigar to the ground in a rage. It is clear that Ford made Wayne redo Harry Carey's gesture of the throwing away cigarettes at each significant narrative moment when he played the role of Shay and Harry in silent Universal Westerns. In The Quiet Man, 1953, the ex-boxer Wayne returns to the countryside. Close to a forest, he lights a cigarette, seeming to obey some ritual. Just at the moment of throwing away his match, he perceives, through the trees, Maureen O'Hara leading her sheep on the grassy slope. It is as if, in lighting his cigarette, he has provoked the apparition of this dreamlike creature. His gesture of throwing away the match remains suspended, and he is immobilized, awestruck. He will return to smoking only when the young woman has disappeared. Lighting a cigarette involves something more than simply smoking. In the Fordian thematic configuration, it implies the action of throwing, and has the narrative effect of calling up an erotic feminine presence. Wayne in The Quiet Man is evidence of this constant. McLaglen throwing his cigarette butt in The Informer is equally subject to the narrative effect of this quasi-automatic act. The thematic manifestation of throwing thus provokes starkly different consequences, benign in The Quiet Man, malign in The Informer. This ambiguity ensures thematic regularity, since throwing governs equally the appearance or the disappearance of a beloved being. It also happens that a Fordian hero lights his cigarette when he must renounce a female presence. Thus, at the end of The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, Wayne, having taken the place of his friend James Stewart and killed an outlaw, decides to separate from Vera Miles, for whom he feels something more than friendship. The setting is nocturnal, like Dublin in The Informer, and Wayne's silhouette moves away from a wall in shadow. He throws away his still-burning match. This throwing gesture is like a farewell sign. He will henceforth ruin his life with booze. The cigarette can be an interchangeable thematic detail. What matters is the act of throwing, not the replaceable object. Lighting a lamp can lead to a narrative situation similar to lighting a cigarette. In How Green Was My Valley, when the priest played by Walter Pidgeon returns to his room and lights the lamp, he is surprised by the presence in the dark of Maureen O'Hara, who has come to say goodbye. Transfixed like Wayne in The Quiet Man, the priest suspends his gesture of throwing the match over his shoulder, the same gesture carried out by the Irish hero in The Informer. In Rio Grande, we find again this shadow and light game, staging the emergence of a female body. When cavalry officer Wayne returns to his tent, he lights a lamp with a match that he throws on the ground. Suddenly his wife, O'Hara, emerges. Their fleeting embrace confirms the throwing thematic. Varieties. In this thematic perspective, throwing does not necessarily imply a narrative consequence. The theme sometimes provides a burlesque effect, like the enormous custard pie collected by Wayne in The Wings of Eagles 1957, the whiskey in the chair thrown by Wayne and Lee Marvin in Donovan's Reef 1963, or the chewing tobacco that veteran Francis Ford happily directs into the court spittoon in Judge Priest 1934. This spit being invisible, the filmmaker uses a sound effect. During the defense prosecutor's speech, this spittoon noise deflates the solemn institutional discourse. Similarly, for the diligent coachman Francis Ford, who spits before a high-ranking officer, Henry Fonda, in Fort Apache. When it comes to objects destined for movement, like the acrobat's knife in the scene of prison recreation in Up the River, 1930, prison recreation in Up the River, 1930, that act of throwing engenders no narrative effect. There is nothing extraordinary about such a performer, played by Spencer Tracy, throwing a knife. It is natural for an American soldier on the World War I battlefield to throw grenades, as James Cagney does in What Price Glory, 1952. The situation is less natural when the throwing theme has a metonymic function. Compare the battle scene in Ford's colour version of What Price Glory to the corresponding scene in Raoul Walsh's silent, black and white 1926 version. In Ford, war is symbolised by a single scene of grenade throwing in a near abstract artificial set lit in an almost expressionist manner. One can understand why Ford adapted the celebrated play Mr. Roberts, written by Thomas Hagen and Joshua Logan, and performed on Broadway by Henry Fonda, for the screen, without rehashing the split between director and actor over this project. We can imagine that Ford was interested, above all, in two key moments of the play that feature spectacular throwing, while not knowing which of the three directors, Ford, Mervyn LeRoy, who replaced him, or Joshua Logan, shot the scenes in which Fonda and Lemon throw the captain's pot plants into the sea. We can be almost certain that this hybrid film is signed John Ford because of this repetition of the act of throwing. The two television films made in the 1950s and 60s, both with baseball as their subject, recount the misadventures of a star far from the stadium, falsely accused of having received casks of wine. Ford does not show any player throwing the ball, for this particular act of throwing has no meaning for him. Note by contrast how the memory of two players remains inscribed in the mass public's memory because of their characteristic way of throwing. In Rookie of the Year 1955, it is not a ball but a bat which is thrown. A sports reporter, John Wayne, comments on the way that the rookie throws his bat away after each failed play, uncovering the family link between the young debutant and a celebrated player, Ward Bond, now in retirement. In Flashing Spikes 1962, another player, James Stewart, split from the professional league, saves a young hopeful who has been unjustly accused. His identity is spotted because of his habitual gesture of plucking up courage, taking a little dirt and throwing it over his shoulder. For Ford, it is the eloquence of gesture which prevails. In emotional situations, characters throw anything which comes into their hands. At the end of Arrowsmith 1931, the humanitarian doctor Ronald Coleman throws his whiskey glass against a wall as he decides to adopt a new life. In Drums Along the Mohawk 1939, an Indian, tired of the interminable chase through forests and valleys, hurls his spear at the silhouette of Henry Fonda disappearing over the horizon. In shame and disappointment, having failed his final mission, John Wayne throws his hat down on the desk of his commander, George O'Brien, and she wore a yellow ribbon. For Fonda, this will be a joyful gesture as he throws his hat into the air, after inviting Kaffee Downs to dance with him in My Darling Clementine. Wayne, accompanied by Maureen O'Hara, will perform the same gesture even more spectacularly in The Quiet Man, confirming that the act of throwing illuminates each film differently. In a dramatic context, Thomas Mitchell, struck by a thrown object on fire, will fall down dead at the end of The Long Voyage Home, 1940. Whilst the drunken Dr. Mitchell in Stagecoach 1939 throws his whiskey at the chimney to express his distrust of the banker, Burton Churchill, the flames fanned by the alcohol visually translate his emotion. In The Searchers 1956, the old Southerner John Wayne expresses his edginess by performing the same gesture in a Mexican restaurant, but in a more striking way. It is a colour film in front of his nephew who is finishing a meal. Rio Grande, upset at not having understood the word arsonist uttered by Maureen O'Hara, Victor McLaglen throws a bucket in the river. In My Darling Clementine, Victor Mature, in despair, throws his empty glass at the medical certificate hanging on the wall. At the bar in The Horse Soldiers, 1959, after the battle with the Southerners, the Colonel, Wayne, will take furious recourse to throwing his whiskey glass at a colleague, Willis Bouchy, who, among the wounded, had thought only of his own career. Solo on Solidarity. The act of throwing isolates the thrower. Alone at the bar, without his colleagues in the military community, John Wayne explains his hatred of doctors to Constance Towers. At the end of his long monologue, he throws his bottle at the glasses on the bar. This behaviour from a Northern officer in The Horse Soldiers is ambiguous, even contradictory. Each time he is successful in a military operation, he throws objects in anger, as if he had failed in his duty. Obliged to command his regiment to fire on the Southerners despite his abhorrence at starting battles, he traces with his wide arm the gesture of throwing his hat on the ground in despair. When his regiment reaches the point of overpowering the Southern front, Wayne arrives on his horse at the height of fighting. To express his disgust at the useless gunfire, he throws the scarf from around his neck into the distance. We should not pretend that these gestures of Wayne's illustrate Ford's anti-militarism or supposed pacifism. What is essential is that the throwing theme isolates the Wayne character at the heart of his profession and shows his solitude. On the narrative plane, how the act of throwing creates an event is by showing the Colonel's neck deprived of the scarf that has been thrown far away, and which is then replaced by the silk scarf from Towers' hair. During his last mission, when he destroys a bridge in order to escape a bloody battle, he ties this scarf around his neck. In Fort Apache, this time without any erotic context, Wayne will again thrown his scarf to the ground when he realizes that his regiment, under Henry Fonda's command, is trapped in a hopeless battle, for they could have fled. This throwing gesture, which expresses renunciation, echoes that of Chief Cochise, who picks things up from the ground in order to once more throw them down.